What's going on, everyone? I'm just a typical, average American here today to react to how Europe might have really figured out how to deal with the Trump. And so today, I want to check out this video by TLDR News talking about how Europe managed to come out on top in this whole Greenland situation. I mean, Trump, it really appears that he has pretty much given up on trying to take over Greenland, or he's at least walked it way back, and he promised that the US would never use military force to take Greenland, which was like a big sigh of relief for everybody. It is Trump at the end of the day, so what he promises one day, who knows what'll happen, the next day, but based on how that entire situation was kind of headed and how things were escalating, this is kind of an amazing result. And I think it mostly has to do with how Europe responded to the whole Trump threats and the Greenland situation. So I'm really curious to learn about if Europe has really cracked some kind of code on how to deal with Donald Trump. So let's take a look.
When the transatlantic showdown over Greenland kicked off last week, most people weren't optimistic about Europe's chances. Trump seemed set on acquiring the territory, and there was pretty widespread scepticism that the EU, which has spent the past year bending over backwards to appease Trump, would be able to muster sufficient resistance.
For me, it wasn't like necessarily a question of could the EU muster enough of a defense or forces, or it was more just like thinking about how insane the entire situation was and how the United States was actually threatening military conflict and sort of the fear of what it would mean if Europe responded with military force of your own. But that actually turned out to be the peaceful solution. That show of force by Europe, actually, it turned out that was actually the perfect way to respond, I guess.
However, after a surprisingly muscular European reaction, Trump apparently backed down.
Yeah.
In the space of just a few hours, he walked back his threats of tariffs and invasion, and announced a so-called framework deal that looks basically identical to the deal the US already had with Denmark.
Yeah, I heard about this. Donald Trump tried to make some kind of announcement to make it seem like he had achieved some kind of great victory with the Greenland thing. Just like I planned, we're making a deal with Denmark and Greenland to establish U.S. military forces to defend it, and maybe have some kind of mineral deal. And it's like, isn't that pretty much what everyone thought was going to happen? Or a lot of that already was in place, and we already have deals with. Did anything really change? Was that whole situation necessary? All it ended up doing was we kind of all ended up in the same exact place that we started, except everyone around the world is way more skeptical of the United States. Our reputation took a major hit, rightfully so, but that seems to be the end result of it. It's just bad for us.
So, in this video, we're going to have a look at Trump's U-turn, and why the experience of the past couple of days implies that appeasement is no longer the least bad option for the EU when it comes to dealing with Trump.
Appeasement is no longer the least bad, so it's not the best. That's a weird way to say that, but yeah, that's kind of what I would take away from this. It's kind of weird, as an American to talk about it from this point of view, because it's very, much it's very much admitting that like the rest of the world should not try to appease the United States. And, you know, I think a lot of Americans actually agree with that, certainly when we're talking about, you know, the US government threatening other sovereign countries with like military attacks. It's crazy. And a lot of Americans don't agree with that. So, yeah.
And ringing the bell. So let's start with a quick recap of what's happened in the past couple of days. This story really began over the weekend, when Trump, who had repeatedly refused to rule out using military force to annex Greenland, threatened an additional 10% tariff on 8 European countries who were apparently obstructing his efforts at annexation.
That's right. That's right. A bunch of European countries came to the defense of Greenland, actually sending like troops, real military troops to Greenland as a show of like strength and saying, well, if the US is threatening Greenland, we're taking that seriously. Which I'm starting to think Donald Trump actually didn't expect somehow. And when Europe did this, it really freaked him out, or at least like it made Donald Trump really respect like the EU and these European countries. And it's funny because like China, for example, is supposed to be like the adversary of the United States, or our rival, our competitor, and our enemy, and yet you rarely actually hear Donald Trump like talking that badly or making fun of China or their leader, because he respects them in a weird way, because China really doesn't have a policy of trying to appease Donald Trump at all. They don't even try. They do counter tariffs and they don't care. And some weird part of Donald Trump seems to respect this kind of thing. That's what I noticed with that, and I noticed with this right here, with Europe retaliating in this manner. It seems aggressive. It's the opposite of like appeasing him. It's literally fighting against him. But lo and behold, look at the result.
This provoked fury in Europe, but Trump doubled down on Tuesday, insisting on Truth Social that Greenland is imperative for national and world security, and there can be no going back. Now, at this point, many people thought Europe would essentially fold and find some way to appease Trump. After all, this has basically been Europe's strategy for dealing with Trump since he returned to office. When Trump attacked NATO for not spending enough on defence, for instance, and cast doubt on whether the US would respond to the triggering of Article 5, NATO Secretary General responded by calling him daddy and implausibly committed to spend 5% of GDP on defence, more than double the existing 2% target.
It's unfortunate because, like, I get it. You want to live in a world where everyone like can get along and even make concessions like this, but in like a cooperative manner. Or anyway, trying to do that approach with Donald Trump simply, you know, from Europe's point of view, it's not productive for Europe, and it hasn't really worked out that well.
Similarly, instead of retaliating against Trump's tariff threats last year, the EU accepted an embarrassingly lopsided trade deal, which included not only a 15% flat tariff on most European exports to the US, but also a commitment to purchasing $750 billion worth of American energy products and investing a further $500 billion into the US.
Yeah, again, this is kind of funny, or not like ha-ha funny, but like odd. It's kind of funny to think, like, as an American, some of this stuff is probably good for me, but I think what kind of pushed me over the edge, and a lot of Americans, was particularly this Greenland situation, and also a lot of things happening right now in the United States here, crazy things happening. It's kind of pushed a lot of us over the line where we're like, I don't really like just focusing on what's going to benefit the United States is not necessarily what's best for the world. like us forcibly taking over Greenland and going to war with the NATO countries. That's not good for anybody. So, yeah, that's why I think you can be American and pro United States and love this country, but also disagree with a lot of the stuff that we've been doing lately.
Unsurprisingly, this deal wasn't well received in Europe, but the EU argued that it was a necessary price to pay to keep Trump on side and avoid a sudden withdrawal of American military support for Ukraine. Anyway, you get the idea. When Trump restarted his overtures towards Greenland, there was a pretty widespread expectation that the EU would find some way to appease him, as they've done in the past.
And that's probably what Donald Trump was expecting, to be honest.
However, contrary to expectations, the European response was surprisingly muscular.
Yeah.
The European Parliament formally suspended the ratification process for the EU-US trade deal. The European Commission dusted off the retaliatory tariffs it prepared during last year's trade negotiations, which would affect about 30% of all US exports to the EU, and French President Emmanuel Macron was apparently able to convince most other European leaders that, if Trump were to follow through with his new tariff threats, the EU should use its new anti-coercion instrument, sometimes dubbed the Trade Bazooka, to restrict American companies' access to the European market.
Yeah, so Europe was ready to battle, financially hurt us, physically with troops, all started enacting some of the old tariff retaliation stuff from last year. I didn't expect all this, to be honest, and Donald Trump certainly didn't.
A number of European countries even deployed troops to the territory, and Denmark promised to expand its military footprint on the territory in the future.
That really shocked me. To me, that action there, all the European militaries being sent to Greenland, that was maybe the biggest shock to me, and I think a lot of people, where it was like, oh my God, this is getting very, very real very quickly, and I think it scared Donald Trump a bit.
The numbers involved were small, and the deployment was framed as a way of addressing Trump's stated concerns about Greenland security, rather than as an anti-American deterrence force.
Right. It's kind of like twofold. Like sending troops to defend Greenland from anybody. That's like a convenient way to kind of phrase it. But at the end of the day, obviously, it was a response to what Donald Trump was threatening as well.
But it still didn't go down well with Trump, who took to Truth Social to warn that these countries were playing a very dangerous game.
Oh, okay. It's all of you playing a very dangerous game. Yeah. Okay. No, that is so... Oh my God. Yeah, sure. It's not the United States at all who started this. It's you guys. You got to stop this dangerous game. What? That is so ridiculous.
This set the stage for a transatlantic showdown in Davos, where Trump was due to give a speech on Wednesday in front of most of his European counterparts. However, in this much-anticipated speech, which ended up going on for more than an hour, Trump actually backed down and finally ruled out using force to annex the territory.
Yeah.
Then, a few hours later, Trump also walked back both his tariff threats and his insistence on asserting American sovereignty over Greenland, announcing on Truth Social that he and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte had agreed a framework deal for the territory, and that, as a result, Trump wouldn't be going ahead with his tariff threats. According to reports, this framework deal would basically mean that US bases in Greenland would be considered sovereign US territory, much like British bases in Cyprus.
I see.
Trump and co will obviously try to spin this as a win, but to be honest, it's hard to see how this is functionally any different from the status quo.
It has absolutely been tried to be spun as a big win here in the US, and I don't know. I think a lot of people aren't really buying it or are just like confused. Like, why did we do all that? And this is what happened. What?
Denmark had already granted the US near unlimited freedom to deploy military assets to the territory, and signalled on multiple occasions that they're happy to go further. That any new bases will now technically be considered sovereign US territory might sound cool, but it doesn't make any practical difference.
Yeah, I didn't know about that part. The bases our bases are now US territory. Maybe that makes like Donald Trump feel better. It's actually very clever from Greenland, whoever negotiated this deal, because it's such a perfect example of like making Donald Trump feel like he did something, but not really.
After all, it's not like Denmark and Greenland were policing what was happening on US military bases beforehand. So you get the idea. While MAGA might insist otherwise, it looks like Trump chickened out. A couple of days ago, he was insisting he needed sovereignty over
God.
Greenland and threatened tariffs and military action to get there. Now he's quietly walked back his talk of tariffs and military action and essentially accepted the status quo.
And you rarely see Donald Trump do stuff like this. Basically admit he was wrong. Almost never does that. This is exceptional, I have to say. And he was adamant that the US needed Greenland for our survival. To walk that back, that's pretty amazing.
Albeit with some cosmetic changes. And this experience holds a valuable lesson for Europe. When it's united, it can win against Trump. In other words, Europe doesn't have to just accept appeasement as the least bad option. This is in part because Trump has less leverage over Europe than he once did. He's already imposed some pretty steep tariffs.
It's like in school, like if you're getting bullied by some mean bully at school, like you can try to appease them. You can give them your lunch money. You can do their homework for them. At the end of the day, they're not going to leave you alone until you punch them in the face or something. I'm not condoning violence, but that's kind of the analogy here.
And they haven't been as catastrophic for the European economy as many people expected. So European leaders are less intimidated by his trade threats. Similarly, Europe is less reliant on American support for Ukraine than it once was.
Right.
The US stopped sending new weapon systems months ago. Europe is now financing Ukraine's war effort with joint debt, and France has mostly replaced the US when it comes to intelligence sharing.
Wow.
But it's mainly because Trump has very little tolerance for economic turmoil at the moment. Most Americans really disapprove of Trump's economy this time around, with his net approval rating on the issue sitting at about -15.
Yeah.
Trump is clearly conscious of this political vulnerability, hence all his recent talk of affordability, and this has apparently made him more sensitive to economic risks. This would
Okay,
explain...
that makes sense. As an American, I can confirm that's absolutely true. A lot of Americans are very unhappy. Times are very tough. People are not thriving financially like they expect to in the great American economy. And I know Donald Trump finds it very, very embarrassing when our economy doesn't do well. When he is president, he takes a lot of pride in that. So he's probably going to start printing tons of money and lower rates and try to stimulate America's economy at some point just to look good. But it kind of makes sense for Europe to exploit this sort of leverage that Trump is on and his back foot a bit, trying to avoid any economic damage.
Why Trump backed down when the EU started talking about retaliatory tariffs and trade bazookas, which triggered a sharp sell-off in the stock market. Even if another transatlantic trade war would, overall, hurt Europe more than the US, politically Trump can't afford any more economic headwinds. Conversely, for most European leaders, picking a fight with Trump is good politics. Trump is incredibly unpopular in Europe, and many European incumbents have...
Really? No way. This is shocking news. He's not popular in Europe? Really? That's so... I couldn't have imagined.
...come under fire from opposition parties for not standing up to him. Now, you're probably looking to...
Okay. That's the end. Okay. That was great. Again, this was by TLDR News. Really great channel. And it really keeps me in the loop of understanding what's happening in Europe and how Europe is responding and perceiving American stuff like this. And this whole Greenland situation was really extraordinary. Extraordinarily scary and stupid on our part. And this was probably one of the best outcomes for the world. And not for the US. it just damaged our reputation. But it's interesting to see from Europe's point of view how this is a win, and how maybe this is the beginning of Europe just not even trying to appease Trump. A new strategy, like make Trump respect and fear you. That's kind of been his strategy that he uses. So I think that worked well in this case, and Trump is probably pretty worried about that. So this was pretty fascinating, actually. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, feel free to give this video a like, or leave a comment with your thoughts on this whole Trump, Europe, Greenland situation. That'd be really interesting to hear about. And if you're interested in more videos like this, feel free to subscribe for more. And until then, thanks for watching, and see you next time.